We are just starting a sequence of about an hour devoted to various Daniel Cohen-related activities. But in fact, we are not really starting the Daniel Cohen-related activity because this very forum is very much the brainchild of Daniel. It's something that he thought about and designed with the CEPR, with the view of making, his notion was that it should be called Paris in June. So this is what we are doing this past few days. The first sequence of it is devoted to something we already started last year when we joined here together shortly after Daniel Cohen passed away. We decided to launch a prize in his memory and in his name, and the prize, very much in keeping with his style, was to honor a young economist, and in particular the way it evolves is to pick the best dissertation of a topic related to the Paris Policy Forum every year. So this is the second year. The jury is made of the keynote speakers of the conference. So Marianne, who is here, and Steve, and David Otter, who was here yesterday, plus myself and Pascaline, who is the scientific director of Paris School of Economics, and Jean-Marc Talon, and the representative of the École Normale, who varies depending on the topic. Before I let you, I proceed with it, I just want to thank the people who made this possible. First of all, you will Emmanuel Boussard, who generously endowed the prize so that it can continue in eternity, presumably. And second, the Association à Ulm, so that the former students of École Normale Supérieure, who not only launched it, but have continued to fund it generously this year again. I'm now going to pass it to Martin from Ulm to talk a little bit more about the nature of this prize and why we are doing it, and then to Michel Cohen, Daniel's brother, who will present our laureate and deliver the prize, and then finally to our laureate, who will actually treat you with a presentation of what his work is all about. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 years ago, exactly now, we began losing hope that Daniel Cohen would overcome the illness that he was fighting against. And indeed, a couple of months later, he died, leaving his family, his friends, his colleagues, and his students in sorrow. But he lives on, not only in our memories, but through his intellectual heritage. A few weeks ago, at the commencement ceremony of École Normale Supérieure, 2 students, Augustin and Diane, spoke in the name of the graduating economists. And this is what they said. We are forever grateful to the man who gave so much to every generation of École Normale students, and who, with passion and humor, rendered understandable the most obscure mathematical models in economics. Daniel Cohen gave us the sense and the appetite for public policy. We owe him to live up to his standard of humanism. Good economic theory can take strange twists. It can go from the most general ideas to micro problems, or the other way around. I'm certain that Daniel would have loved to comment on Davy Houek's remarkable work on the taxi industry in Senegal and what can be learned from this experiment about the impact of technology on labor relations. Thank you.
Well, I would like, so I'm Michel Cohen, Daniel's brother. I would like to thank Esther and Jean-Olivier and the Paris School of Economics, the École Normale Supérieure, Martin and the alumni of École Normale Supérieure, Emmanuel Boussard, and all the members of the jury, which made this second Daniel Cohen Award possible. When I looked at your work, Davy, I wondered, how a two-field experiment on Senegalese taxi could ever fit my brother's legacy. And so, you know, I talked to his daughter, my niece, the famous Pauline, and together we reviewed actually your work and your conclusion, where, according to what you're going to show, 50% of the taxi drivers, primarily the worst performing and the poorest, decline to adopt digital payment when transactions are observable by the taxi owners, even though it's financially more efficient for them. So we wondered with Pauline whether Daniel would have liked it or not. And after reviewing it, and those who know Daniel in the room already know the answer, right? Because actually we are absolutely certain that my brother would have loved it. Yes, he would have loved your work. He would have come back to you with so many comments and questions. You know, was there a difference between the men taxi drivers and the women taxi drivers? Was there a difference between the young taxi drivers and the old taxi drivers? And so on and so forth. He would have deep dived into it and debated with you at length like a delicacy. So, you have to know that my brother was absolutely passionate about the impact of technology on contractual relationships and moral hazard in the workplace, as well as all the cascading consequences of asymmetric information. Asymmetric information was this thing, you know, and you know, as was a banker, and basically, you know, is one of his main points that, you know, I would never understand how market works because of asymmetric information. So thank you for providing an evidence to that. For all these reasons, you know, and again, thank you for all those who have made this second Daniel Cohen Award possible. I'm very proud to deliver this award to you, David. Well done.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very grateful and honored to receive this prize today. On a professional level, I've learned a ton from Daniel Cohen's work, and I've been very inspired by his dedication to really link research with policy, which is something I'm trying to do humbly with my own research. On a more personal level, I remember reading Homo economicus back in the day in my class préparatoire. So it was one of the first economics book I've read, and clearly, surely it shaped this path that I decided to follow. Another anecdote I have is that I remember being interviewed by Daniel Cohen in a room right there 11 years ago for the ENS competitive exam, and I was looking at my notes. I took notes of this meeting because I was particularly nervous and stressed at that meeting, knowing who he was. And I remember like reading the note, how kind and engaging he was with my half-baked ideas back in the days. And I've learned since then that this generosity and curiosity is something that he has left behind with many of you. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna take the next 10 or so minutes to tell you a little bit about the research that led to this prize. But thank you. So I want you to think of digital technologies today. So think of mobile apps, digital payments, software. They are becoming increasingly accessible. And we may think of this technology as a way to improve firm performance. Why? Because they change the way firms operate. But by definition, these technologies, being digital, they store, generate, and process data. And as economists, we typically think of this observability or this data as beneficial for firms. Why? Because one, it could reduce information frictions. It can increase contract efficiency between the employer and the employee that can better observe what the employee is doing within the firms. But what this idea often omits is that this observability might not be beneficial for some parties within the firm, for instance, the employees. And in many settings, we know that the employees have some decision on the adoption of these new technologies. And so in other words, this observability embedded in many digital tools that we have access to nowadays can be a double-edged sword. It creates a trade-off. This observability may be of value for some people, like the firm owners, but it may be costly in terms of adoption for the employees in many contexts. And despite this idea being potentially broadly relevant across a range of different sectors, so my case study is in the context of digital payments for taxi driver, you may think of many principal-agent relationship where this could be at play. We talked earlier about, like, this is a second example, we talked earlier about work from home when, like, with the rise of software technology that can give a tool for the employer to better observe what the employees is doing, especially if they are working from home. And that might lead to some resistance or potentially some selection into which kind of job people choose in the first place. And despite being relevant and potentially prevalent, we have very limited evidence of its importance and how much does it matter empirically. So to make progress on this topic, I asked two research questions in the paper. The first is, how do digital technology affect firm performance? And how does it affect, in particular, information frictions and contract between the employer and the employee? And two, to what extent this latter set of impacts may hinder digital technology adoption in the first place? To address this question, I proceed in 3 steps. First, I designed a new digital payment solution with Senegal's largest payment provider. And I'm going to roll out this technology in the taxi industry as a case study. I use this technology in particular to run 2 randomized experiments guided by contract theory to think about how it affects to think about the impact and the adoption constraints of the technology itself. And in the last part of the paper, I think about how developing a relational contract theoretical framework that will really help me generalize this finding a little bit more outside this sector and think of some policy counterfactuals that could be useful to compare and thinking about welfare particularly. So let me dive in. And what kind of technology am I talking about here? I'm talking about digital payments. So the story here is, back in the day in Senegal in 2022, I partnered with Wave. You should think of Wave as the Lydia or the M-Pesa of West Africa in some way. They are doing the P2P transaction, personal transaction from mobile phone to other mobile phone. And at that time, they didn't have a suitable product for the taxi industry. So I worked together with them to design one. Why do I pick the taxi industry? You should think of the taxi industry as one example of this principal-agent relationship between a taxi owner that typically do not own their car, so they contract with a taxi driver, and the driver will pay a rent at the end of the week to the owner and keep the surplus. The key difference with, let's say, the US or the French taxi industry is that here the taxi driver is not paying the rent in advance, they are paying after working, and they may default on it. Why? Because they may not collect enough money. So there's some limited liability, which leads to some informational gains potentially for the taxi owner here to have, because they may want to know what, if my driver default, why this is. Is it a lack of effort? Is it a misreporting of revenue? Or is it coming from just a bad luck in this day? And digital payments could help, the digital transactions could help knowing that. The second characteristic of this sector is that this is a sector with high cost of using cash. So this technology itself is maybe particularly valuable for drivers to have. They struggle with small change shortages. They struggle with safety concern with using cash. So we think of this payment system as potentially a good thing for drivers, absent this observability piece. So the way it works is that I adapted this technology and I brought it today to show you. This looks like this in practice. It's a simple QR code that taxi drivers could put on their rearview mirror to accept customer payments digitally compared to cash. This is a simple solution, but my paper's key idea is that this is not only a way to receive customer payment, this also generates data. And this data can be used potentially by the taxi owners to know better what the taxi driver is doing. And so this key idea will be driving the experimental sample, the experimental design, and then the paper. So it looks like this in practice. Now, what do? I use this technology to think about both the impact and the adoption of this tool. So I hired a team of about 50 surveyors in Dakar, in Senegal, to go around and list all of the interested drivers, like presenting them with the product and looking at who is interested. This is a context where there is no formal registry of taxi owners, so it's hard to go there. So you need to go to the employee to roll out these kind of tools. And what I realized from this exercise is that most of the drivers were very interested. 90% almost. They have been struggling with cost of using cash, so they saw that as an opportunity to digitalize their payment system. But clearly, they were split in two groups out of disinterested drivers. Half of those were willing to give their owners contact information, which was a prerequisite to adopt the technology for the company to sign some paperwork. The other half refused and therefore could not adopt the digital payment solution. So I ran 2 experiments on these 2 samples to understand the impact for the one willing to adopt and the adoption constraints for the one reluctant to do so. For the pair of owner drivers willing to adopt, I ran what I call the impact experiments, where I take an owner and a driver. Typically, it's 1 driver per owner in this sector for 90% of owners. And I randomize access to digital payments. For the one given access, for the pairs given access, I randomize whether the taxi owners can observe the taxi driver's transaction with different treatment arm here. I won't go into too much detail. Each of these will tell me about mechanism. But the key takeaways here is that from this experiment, I'm able to separate the pure effect of digital payments on the taxi firms, like think about costs associated with using cash, from all of the other effects this observability as a byproduct might have on the firm, on the taxi firm, in terms of driver's effort, contracting, and potentially firm performance as a whole by doing this randomization. Now, for the other half of drivers that refuse to adopt digital payments, I wanted to understand why. And so I ran the adoption experiments when I go back to these drivers and randomize whether or not the owners can observe their transaction to think about how much this determines the adoption decision of the driver. Now, what do I find? Let me clearly describe the 2 key findings of this research. The first is for the drivers willing to adopt with observability potentially, I find that this technology is beneficial. This reduces this cost associated with using cash by half. So think of small chain shortages going down, for instance, which is not trivial. It's about 5% of drivers' profit going down by half, which leads to high drivers' willingness to pay for the QR code per se, absent observability. Now, when you think about this additional effect of observability, I see that there is 3 additional effects on the taxi firm when I add this randomly. First, I find that when taxi owners can observe a driver's transaction, drivers are working more. I do that by doing a mystery passenger audit, so it's hard to collect this effort data in practice. So the one trick that I find is that to send a team of 20 surveyors going around the city, hailing taxi over and over again, 8,000 of time in practice, and we match the license plate of this taxi to the experimental sample to look at how often do we find the one in my experiment. So I find that this is going up when owners can observe transactions. 2, I find in the survey this time, I survey them over time, over 2 years, and I find that they change the way they contract. In particular, owners are more likely to offer an upfront salary to their drivers, in addition to the rental payment contract, when they can observe the transaction, which I explain in the theory as a way to compensate them for the increased effort. And lastly, I find an increase in the duration of the relationship. So this is a relationship that is typically very frictional. So the owners and drivers will often split due to lack of trust. And I find that trust is going up when owners can observe the driver's transaction. And altogether, this leads to an increase in profit, at least as suggestive evidence for the owners. So the impact here is that this digital technology can reshape relationship, as we see, the contract change, but also improve firm performance for the adopters, in addition to just getting the payment system for drivers. But this is not the end of the story, right? Because 50% of drivers will still refuse to adopt the payment solution. So I ran this second experiment when I go back to them, and first I try to understand who they are. Who are those 50%? I look at characteristics, and I find that these are the worst performing drivers. In the survey, they are also more stressed at work compared to the one who adopted, who are willing to adopt. But also I find that they are the poorest drivers, which mean that this observability may have some welfare consequences if it prevents these poorest people in practice to adopt this otherwise profitable solution. So what I do is I go back, I remove this observability for half of those in partnership with this payment company. And what I find is that adoption rate doubled in the group of reluctant drivers, meaning that observability is a key barrier to adoption for this in this market by many drivers that are reluctant to do so. In the last part of the paper, and I will be brief on this one, I try to think of this result and extrapolate to think of what are the key ingredients you need in the market to explain this trade-off, to drive this trade-off. So I developed a principal agent model with the owner and drivers, relational contracting with two types of drivers that differ by their disutility of work. And I won't go into much detail, but I want to tell you what it gives me. It gives me the key friction you need. In particular, more hazard, we talked about it earlier, limited liability that really prevents the drivers to pay this rent, that makes this problem potentially worse in this setting. And the one that I find particularly important is weak contract enforcement, that really prevents the taxi owner from committing to not use the new informations once the taxi driver adopts the technology. And we know that these three frictions are potentially prevalent in lower and middle income countries, which makes this trade-off potentially worse in this setting. I use this theory also to think of policy counterfactuals, and one that you might have in mind is what would happen if we remove observability for everybody? What would happen in terms of welfare? Now everyone can adopt, taxi owners can still not see the transaction. What are the gains and costs from doing so? So I think of that in the last part of the paper. So I want to leave you with three key takeaways for today's presentation. The first is on the theory side, like information frictions, we find that here really define relational contracting. We know that it may be even worse in settings with relational verbal contract because of this lack of enforcement. And that's something we need to think about if we want to think about employment and how these technologies affect the workplace. The second is most digital technology. This is payment. This is about payment, but you can think of software or any others. Increase observability. This may be beneficial if it reduces more hazard, but it also redefines relationship between people because now I have more information about you. And that's my third point, can lead to differential adoption in my context, by the worst performing, but also the poorest drivers. In other words, the digital observability embedded in this technology may be a double-edged sword with welfare consequences to think about. As a result of this research, the company decided to remove this observability component embedded in this digital tool to allow more drivers, especially the reluctant one, to adopt the technology. If one day you go to Dakar, you will see the majority of drivers having access to this QR code. So I think of this as potentially a case study where research and policy or practitioners can learn from researchers to better design this kind of technology. And this is something I'm excited to continue studying in the years to come. Thank you so much again for having me. Yes.